These were powerful field artillery pieces, capable of firing shells over 15 miles. If positioned correctly, they could strike landing forces at both Utah and Omaha simultaneously. Concrete casemates were constructed to protect the guns. Ammunition bunkers were built underground. Defensive trenches connected strong points. Machine gun nests were positioned to cover every approach. From a German perspective, the cliffs themselves were part of the defense. Sheer rock faces discouraged any thought of assault from below. The only practical access was from inland, and inland approaches were heavily defended. To the planners of the Atlantic Wall, Pointe du Hoc was naturally secure. But for Allied planners studying aerial reconnaissance photographs in England, the battery represented a lethal threat. If those 155 mm guns opened fire during the landings, troop transports, supply vessels, and soldiers crowding the beaches could be devastated. Omaha Beach in particular would be vulnerable. The invasion of Western Europe, Operation Overlord, depended on synchronized landings across 5 beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, Sword. The success of each sector influenced the others. If one collapsed, the entire line could fracture. Neutralizing Pointe du Hoc became a priority. In early 1944, Allied planners faced a difficult question: bombard the battery from the air or seize it by force. Heavy bombing raids were conducted in the weeks leading up to D-Day. Allied aircraft dropped tons of explosives on Pointe du Hoc. Naval guns practiced range calculations. Yet aerial reconnaissance photographs suggested that the reinforced concrete casemates remained intact. The thick walls were designed precisely for this purpose, to survive bombardment. There was no guarantee the guns would be destroyed from a distance, and there was no room for uncertainty. The task of eliminating the battery was assigned to the 2nd Ranger Battalion, a unit of the U.S. Army formed in 1943 and modeled partly on British commandos. Rangers were volunteers. They underwent rigorous physical training in Scotland and England. Climbing, small unit assault tactics, amphibious landings, they were trained for operations others avoided. The battalion commander was Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder, a former football coach from Texas. He was methodical, disciplined, and understood that his men would face extreme risk. The mission required scaling a near-vertical cliff under enemy fire, securing the summit, and destroying the artillery, all within minutes of the main landings. The plan was precise. At each hour following a naval bombardment, Ranger companies would approach Pointe du Hoc in landing craft. Specialized equipment had been prepared. Rocket-fired grappling hooks attached to ropes. Extension ladders mounted on decoy amphibious trucks, borrowed from London fire brigades. Hand-over-hand rope ascents trained repeatedly in England. Naval gunfire from ships, including the battleship USS Texas, would suppress German defenders just before the Rangers reached the cliffs. Timing was everything. If the Rangers were delayed, the artillery might fire on the beaches. If they failed to climb, the guns would remain operational. If they suffered too many casualties before reaching the top, the mission would collapse. There was also a contingency. If the 2nd Rangers could not seize Pointe du Hoc, the 5th Ranger Battalion and elements of the 116th Infantry Regiment landing at Omaha were prepared to move westward and support them. But that plan assumed Omaha itself would be secure, an assumption that would soon prove dangerously optimistic. Intelligence reports indicated that approximately 125 to 200 German troops defended the position. These included artillery crews and elements of the 352nd Infantry Division, a capable and battle-hardened unit recently repositioned into the Normandy sector. This division was stronger than Allied planners had originally believed. The Rangers trained relentlessly in the weeks before June 6. They practiced climbing cliffs in England under simulated fire. They rehearsed rope deployment in darkness. Equipment was modified repeatedly. Yet even with preparation, uncertainty lingered. Tidal conditions were unpredictable. Currents along the Normandy coast were strong. Smoke and bombardment debris could obscure visibility. And perhaps most critically, intelligence could be wrong. On the night of June 5, 1944, the Rangers boarded their transport ships. The sea was rough. Many were seasick. Equipment was checked and rechecked in dim light. Ammunition was distributed. Thermite grenades were prepared. These would be used to disable the artillery by melting their mechanisms if found intact. At approximately 4:30 a.m., landing craft began lowering into the channel. The invasion of Normandy had begun. As thousands of Allied troops approached the French coastline across 5 sectors, a small force of Rangers headed toward a narrow cliff that German engineers considered naturally impregnable. At 6:30 a.m., delayed by navigation errors and strong currents, the Rangers would reach the base of Pointe du Hoc, and what they found there was not exactly what intelligence had promised. The men of the 2nd Ranger Battalion were not conscripts pulled at random. They were volunteers. Many were in their early 20s. Some had already seen combat in North Africa and Sicily. Others were newly assigned but had completed demanding commando-style training in Scotland. Selection standards were high. Physical endurance, marksmanship, discipline, all were tested. Yet no training exercise truly replicates a 100-foot vertical climb under live fire. As their landing craft neared the cliffs on the morning of June 6, 1944, many Rangers could barely see the summit. Naval bombardment had thrown smoke and debris into the air. German machine gun tracers cut downward through the haze. Mortar rounds splashed into the surf. One landing craft was struck before it reached shore. Water flooded boots as ramps dropped into chest-deep surf. Ropes had to be lifted above heads to keep them dry. Radios malfunctioned. Some grappling hooks became tangled before launch. The current pushed boats eastward, forcing last-minute course corrections. There was no dramatic speech, no orchestrated charge, just small groups of men moving toward a cliff face that appeared vertical and slick with seawater. They had been told the ascent would take minutes. From below, it looked endless. Still, they moved, not because the cliff was climbable, but because the mission required it. From a defensive standpoint, Pointe du Hoc was formidable. The cliffs themselves formed a natural barrier nearly 100 feet high. At high tide, waves crashed directly against the rock. At low tide, attackers would still face exposed approaches across open ground before reaching the base. German defenders positioned machine guns along the cliff edge and in trenches overlooking likely landing points. Grenades could be thrown downward, stones could be dislodged. The defenders held the advantage of elevation, visibility, and prepared positions. Military doctrine historically favors the defender on high ground. Gravity assists the defense. Fields of fire widen. Attackers must expose themselves while climbing. The Germans believed no conventional infantry assault would attempt a direct vertical climb. The cliffs were considered protection enough. Yet Allied planners saw a narrow window. Naval gunfire could temporarily suppress defenders. If grappling hooks secured successfully, small assault teams could scale rapidly before German troops reorganized. The surprise would compensate for exposure. It was a calculated gamble. Rocket-fired grappling hooks were launched from below, trailing ropes upward. Some caught onto protruding rocks or barbed wire. Strong currents, high bluffs, and entrenched German defenders would make it the bloodiest landing sector that day. A functioning battery at Pointe du Hoc could compound the disaster. Allied Naval Command understood this. So did General Omar Bradley, overseeing U.S. First Army operations. The Rangers' mission was not symbolic. It was preventative, a surgical strike intended to remove a potentially catastrophic threat. And yet, as Rangers secured the cliff top and began moving toward the concrete casemates, a new and unexpected problem emerged. The artillery pieces were not where intelligence had placed them, and in that moment, the mission shifted from assault to search. By approximately 7:10 a.m., the first Rangers were pulling themselves over the lip of Pointe du Hoc. The climb had taken only minutes for some, an eternity for others. Ropes swayed against the cliff face. Wet boots searched for cracks in stone. German defenders leaned over the edge, firing downward. Cutting ropes were possible. Several Rangers fell back into the surf below. Others continued upward without hesitation. The naval bombardment had cratered the summit. The once defined trench network was now a scarred maze of shattered earth and broken concrete. Smoke drifted across the promontory, limiting visibility to yards at a time. Small assault teams spread outward immediately upon reaching the top. There was no pause to regroup. Machine gun nests were engaged at close range. Grenades were thrown into trench intersections. German soldiers emerged from dugouts, some disoriented from bombardment, others firing with discipline. Fighting became fragmented, violent, localized, and fast. Lieutenant Colonel Rudder moved inland despite his wounds, attempting to establish a perimeter. Communication with naval forces was inconsistent. Many radios had been soaked during the landing. Signal lines were unreliable. The Rangers were now largely on their own. Then came the moment that changed the operation's character. Assault teams reached the concrete casemates that intelligence had identified as housing the 155 mm artillery guns. They found them empty. The reinforced structures were intact enough to suggest survival through bombardment, but inside there were no guns, no breech blocks, no ammunition racks loaded for firing. The primary objective appeared to have vanished. For a brief and dangerous window, uncertainty spread through the ranks. Had the guns been destroyed by bombing? Had intelligence misread the photographs? Or had the Germans relocated the artillery before the invasion? If the guns were operational elsewhere nearby, they could still fire onto Omaha or Utah at any moment. The mission had not failed, but it was incomplete. Rudder ordered reconnaissance patrols to push inland beyond the immediate cliff position. Time was critical. German counterattacks were expected once the shock of the initial assault subsided. Meanwhile, German resistance intensified. Sniper fire erupted from concealed positions. Mortar rounds began falling into the cratered ground. Reinforcements from inland elements of the 352nd Infantry Division moved toward the promontory. The Rangers, numbering roughly 225 at landing, had already taken significant casualties during the approach and ascent. They were now isolated. The contingency plan had assumed Omaha Beach would be secured quickly enough for reinforcements to move west. But reports filtering in suggested Omaha itself was encountering fierce resistance. Movement inland was slow and costly. On Pointe du Hoc, the Rangers faced a widening fight with incomplete information. The cliffs had been climbed, the summit had been taken, but the guns, the reason for the assault, were still unaccounted for. Around mid-morning on June 6, 1944, a small patrol moved south from the battered crest of Pointe du Hoc. Among them were Staff Sergeant Jack Kuhn and Sergeant Leonard Lommel of Company D. Their orders were simple and urgent. Locate the missing artillery. Moving cautiously through hedgerows and along sunken lanes, they advanced roughly a mile inland. The terrain of Normandy offered concealment. Thick vegetation, small orchards, and earthen embankments that limited long sightlines. Then they found them. 5 155 guns sat concealed along a dirt track near an orchard. They were not inside the concrete casemates atop the cliffs. Instead, they had been moved slightly inland, likely to protect them from naval bombardment. Telephone wires ran from the guns toward the coast, evidence they could still receive firing coordinates. The artillery pieces were intact, and they were operational. There was no time to wait for reinforcements. Lommel and Kuhn carried thermite grenades, specifically issued for disabling heavy equipment. Thermite burns at extreme temperatures, hot enough to melt metal. Working quickly, they smashed the sights and traversing mechanisms of the guns with rifle butts. Then they placed thermite grenades into the firing assemblies. Molten metal dripped through the mechanisms. Within minutes, the guns were disabled. A nearby ammunition cache was set ablaze. Explosions followed as shells detonated. Smoke rose above the hedgerows. The primary mission of Pointe du Hoc had been accomplished, not by a battalion-sized frontal assault, but by a small reconnaissance team operating independently behind enemy lines. Yet victory brought no relief. Back at the cliffs, German forces began organizing counterattacks. The Rangers' position on the promontory was exposed on 3 sides. They lacked heavy weapons. Ammunition was limited. Casualties were mounting. Throughout June 6 and into June 7, German infantry probed the perimeter repeatedly. Mortar fire intensified. Snipers harassed exposed positions. Attempts were made to split the Ranger line and retake portions of the plateau. Rudder, still wounded, maintained defensive coordination despite limited communication with higher command. Naval gunfire occasionally supported their position when radio contact succeeded, but targeting was difficult amid close-quarters fighting. Isolation became the defining condition. Of the approximately 225 Rangers who had landed, fewer than half remained combat effective by the morning of June 7. Supplies were scarce. Medical evacuation was nearly impossible under fire. Some wounded lay in shell craters for hours before treatment. They held the position for nearly 2 days. Relief finally arrived on June 8, when elements of the 5th Ranger Battalion and the 116th Infantry Regiment broke through from Omaha Beach after securing inland routes. By then, only about 90 Rangers were still able to fight. The cliffs had been climbed. The guns had been destroyed. The guns had been destroyed. The position had been held. The phrase often associated with the Rangers lead the way, was not a slogan on June 6. It was a description of what had occurred. But the cost was measurable in bodies scattered across cratered Earth, and the consequences of their success would ripple across the entire Normandy front. When relief forces reached Pointe du Hoc on June 8, 1944, they did not find a triumphant battalion standing at full strength. They found survivors. Of the roughly 225 men from the 2nd Ranger Battalion who had landed on the morning of June 6, only about 90 remained combat effective 2 days later. The rest were killed, wounded, or missing. Some had fallen during the climb. Others were cut down in trench fighting. Many were hit during the repeated German counterattacks that followed. Casualty rates approached 60%. The ground itself testified to the intensity of the fight. The summit of Pointe du Hoc was transformed into a moonscape. Naval shells had gouged massive craters into the plateau. Trenches were shattered. Concrete casemates were scarred but standing. The earth was churned and unstable, littered with equipment, broken rifles, and abandoned helmets.